My name is Abigail Whitaker. I'm 29 years old, and the last thing my parents gave me before I turned 18 was an old brown backpack and a sentence they had mistaken for kindness. You'll be fine, Abby. They said it after my savings account had been emptied down to 37 cents. They said it after I refused to sign a paper claiming I had voluntarily given my older brother, Preston, $11,840. They said it while my mother stood beside the kitchen table with a pen in her hand, and my father stared at the floor like the linoleum might open up and save him from having to choose. It didn't. I chose for him. I packed 2 work shirts, 1 pair of jeans, my birth certificate, my social security card, and the ATM receipt that proved I wasn't crazy. Then I walked out of the house with everything I owned on my back and $50 in my palm. 2 20s and a 10. That was my father's entire apology. For 5 years, nobody in my family called. Not on my birthday, not at Christmas, not when I finished my paralegal certificate, not when I became a licensed notary signing agent and learned that a signature is never just ink. It is consent with a timestamp. Then, on a Tuesday evening in July, my mother's name appeared on my phone like a door I had nailed shut from the inside. I let it ring 4 times. When I finally answered, she was already crying. "Abby, thank God," she said. "Preston needs you." No hello. No apology. No question about where I lived or whether I had survived the door she pointed me toward. Just Preston. Then she said the words that made my hand go cold around the phone. "We need your signature. Please subscribe to support the channel. Here is a fun little challenge. I bet you are watching this video while lying down with your legs crossed right now. If I guessed correctly, type 3 in the comments. If not, type 4. Let's see how many viewers I got right. And if you enjoy this story and would like to support our team, please consider buying us a cup of coffee through the link in the description. Your support helps us continue creating more meaningful, emotional, and captivating stories for you. Thank you so much for your kindness and support. All right, enough talking, let's begin the story. The thing people never understood about the Whitaker house was that nobody had to shout for the rules to be clear. Our house sat at the end of a quiet street in Ankeny, Iowa, with a trimmed front lawn, a white mailbox, and a wooden sign over the entryway that said, "Bless this family." My mother bought it at a church craft fair and made my father hang it where everyone would see it before they stepped inside. For years, I thought it meant all of us. I was slow to learn the difference between being included and being useful. My older brother, Preston, had been born 5 years before me and somehow arrived already forgiven. That is the only way I know how to explain it. When he forgot homework, he was overwhelmed. When he quit baseball halfway through the season, he was sensitive to pressure. When he backed my father's truck into the garage door at 16, the repair bill meant I didn't get to go on the 8th grade science trip. Nobody connected those 2 things out loud. They didn't have to. When I brought home straight A's, my mother kissed the top of my head and said, "See? I never worry about you." That sounded like love when I was little. Later, I learned it was neglect with better manners. Preston's school pictures lived in frames. Mine lived in envelopes. His Little League trophy stayed on the mantel long after the gold paint started peeling off the plastic batter. My certificate from the statewide essay contest spent 3 months under a stack of grocery coupons before I found it while looking for tape. No one had thrown it away. That would have required noticing it first. My father, Martin, ran a small farm equipment shop that always seemed 1 bad quarter away from closing. My mother, Marlene, taught Sunday school and made casseroles for sick neighbors. In public, she was soft-voiced and generous, the woman who remembered prayer requests and sent handwritten birthday cards. At home, she ran our family like a quiet accounting office. Preston's mistakes went into 1 column: hardship, stress, bad timing. My needs went into another: manageable, unnecessary, already handled. My father rarely disagreed with my mother. He just got quieter, which in our house counted as permission. When Preston needed something, Dad studied his coffee mug, the newspaper, the floor, anything except me. His silence never looked cruel from the outside. That was the problem. It looked tired. It looked peaceful. It looked like a man trying not to make things worse. But when one parent takes from you and the other parent watches, the watching becomes part of the taking. When I was 12, Preston lost the cash my grandmother had given him for a church youth trip. My mother found me in my room counting babysitting money from the Millers down the street and said, "Abby, honey, your brother is embarrassed enough. Can you help cover it?" I gave her $32 and got thanked for being mature. At 14, when Preston needed gas money for a job interview he never made it to, I handed over my birthday money before anyone asked twice. At 16, when Grace was born and Preston suddenly discovered fatherhood was more expensive than taking pictures with a newborn, I became the free babysitter every Saturday night because your brother is trying to get back on his feet. He was always getting back on his feet. I was always the floor. And every time I hesitated, every time I asked why helping him always seemed to mean losing something of mine, my mother would lower her voice like she was blessing me. "You'll be fine, Abby," she'd say. "You always are." I didn't know then that some families don't choose a scapegoat by hating them. Sometimes they choose one by trusting them to survive things no one else should have to carry. By the spring of my senior year, that trust had a number attached to it. $11,840. Every shift, every skipped trip, every birthday bill, I tucked away instead of spending. I thought I was saving for school. I didn't understand yet that my family had already decided what my savings were for. By spring of senior year, my schedule looked like something an adult would call unsustainable if it belonged to anyone but me. I worked 4 evenings a week, at the Hy-Vee pharmacy counter, babysat the Millers twins on Saturdays, and typed claim notes for a small insurance office on Sunday afternoons. Every paycheck went into the joint savings account my mother had helped me open when I was 15, because the bank would not let me open one alone. That detail matters. The account was supposed to be temporary. I had circled my 18th birthday on the calendar in blue ink because that was the morning I could move every dollar into an account with only my name on it. I kept a brochure from Des Moines Area Community College inside my desk drawer, folded open to the paralegal program. Tuition estimates were highlighted, fees were written in the margin. Books were guessed high because I hated surprises. 6 days before my birthday, after a Thursday shift that smelled like hand sanitizer and old prescription bags, I stopped at the ATM outside Hy-Vee to deposit a check for $186. The machine took the envelope, clicked 3 times, and printed my receipt. I almost folded it without looking. Then my eyes caught the balance line. And for a second, I thought the decimal had moved. Available balance, $0.37. I put the card back in and checked again, because when the truth is ugly enough, your brain will try to call it a machine error. Same number. Same tiny insult at the end of 3 years of work. I stood there in my pharmacy polo, while a woman behind me cleared her throat, and I remember feeling embarrassed. I had been robbed, and my first instinct was to apologize for taking too long at the ATM. At home, my mother was in the kitchen drying a plate that was already dry. My father sat at the table with both hands around a glass of iced tea. I laid the receipt between them. Neither of them asked what it was. They already knew. That was the part that made my father look smaller. My mother said Preston was in serious trouble, and sometimes family had to move faster than feelings. She said he could lose his job, his car, maybe even time with Grace if people started asking questions. I asked when they were going to tell me. My father looked down into his tea like the answer might be floating there. My mother gave me the patient Sunday school smile she used on children who forgot Bible verses. After dinner, she said, but Preston's crisis couldn't wait for your birthday. I asked when they would pay it back. That was when her face changed. Not anger exactly. Disappointment, as if I had failed a test only she knew I was taking. Don't make this ugly, Abby, she said softly. Your brother is drowning. You'll be fine. And that was the moment the number stopped being money. It became a measurement. $11,840 was what my family believed my future was worth when Preston needed rescuing one more time. Saturday morning, my mother called me downstairs in the voice she used when company was already on the porch. Calm, bright. Finished before the conversation began. The kitchen table had been cleared except for one typed page, one black pen, and my father's right hand resting flat beside his coffee mug. He would not look at me. That was how I knew the meeting had started before I entered the room, and my part in it had already been assigned. The top of the page read, Family Assistance Agreement. It sounded harmless in the way dangerous things often do when someone has had time to name them. Underneath, in neat paragraphs, it said I had freely given $11,840 to Preston as emergency family support. No repayment expected, no misunderstanding, no ugliness. They did not need the paper to be perfect. They needed my name under the lie. I read it twice. Not because it was complicated, but because I wanted to see if the lie changed shape the second time. It didn't. My mother watched me from near the sink, with her arms folded. Preston was not there. Of course he wasn't. In our family, I was always expected to face the consequences of his emergencies more directly than he was. My mother said signing would let everyone move forward without bitterness. She said people at church did not need to hear an ugly version of something the family had already handled. My father cleared his throat, but no words came out. That was his specialty, almost speaking. I asked if Preston had read the paper. My mother's mouth tightened. This isn't about punishing your brother, she said. This is about protecting the family. There it was again, family, used like a tablecloth, thrown over a broken dish. I looked at my father then, really looked. His shoulders were rounded, his eyes fixed on the table, his thumb rubbing one worn spot on his coffee mug. I used to think his silence meant he was trapped like me. That morning I understood it differently. He had chosen the shelter of her anger, and I was the price of staying dry. I pushed the paper back across the table. I'm not signing that. For 1 second, nobody moved. Even the refrigerator seemed to hum softer. My mother's face did not twist. She did not shout. Shouting would have made her easier to explain later. Instead, she went smooth and quiet, the way ice looks safe until you put weight on it. If you can't stand with your brother, she said, you can stand outside. I waited for my father to say my name. Just my name would have done it. Not an argument, not a rescue. One syllable of proof that I was his daughter before I was a problem. He stared at the table. Then he said, "Don't make your mother do this." That was the sentence that opened the door more than my mother's threat did. I went upstairs and took the old brown backpack from the back of my closet. It still had a broken zipper pull and a faded keychain from the Iowa State Fair. You learn fast what matters when your whole life has to fit into one bag. 2 Hy-Vee polos, 1 pair of jeans, my documents, the ATM receipt in a plastic folder, the pen my grandmother Eleanor had given me, and 1 photo of Grace at 2 years old, smiling over an upside-down picture book. When I came downstairs, my mother was wiping a counter that was already clean. My father stood near the garage door with his hands in his pockets. I walked past him, and he pressed something into my palm without looking at me. 2 20s and a 10. $50. No apology, no warning, no offer to drive me anywhere. Just enough money to make him feel like he had not sent his daughter into the world empty-handed. I sat in my car for 3 minutes with the backpack on the passenger seat and the $50 in my fist. I kept waiting for the enormous feeling to arrive. Rage, panic, grief. Something worthy of the moment. Instead, all I felt was quiet. The kind of quiet that comes when a door closes and you realize the house behind it had been locked for years. Then I started the engine and drove away before anyone could mistake my leaving for a performance. I drove to Nolan Pierce's place because he was the only person I knew who had ever offered help without first explaining what it would cost me. Nolan had worked the photo counter at Hy-Vee during my junior year, and he lived with his aunt in a small ranch house on the south side of Des Moines. When I showed up after dark with a backpack and a face I had not decided what to do with yet, he did not ask for the whole story. He opened the basement door, pointed to an old couch under a plaid blanket, and said, "You can stay until the floor feels less temporary." I stayed 3 months, long enough to learn the sound of his aunt's coffee maker at 5:30 every morning, long enough to know which basement steps squeaked, long enough for my clothes to stop smelling like my mother's laundry soap. I paid them what I could in groceries and cleaning. Nobody asked me to. That was the strange part. In my family, every kindness arrived with a hook in it. At Nolan's house, a sandwich was just a sandwich. A light left on was just a light left on. I did not go to Des Moines Area Community College that fall the way I had planned. Plans are delicate things when someone empties the account underneath them. Instead, I took more hours at Hy-Vee, picked up weekend shifts at a copy center, and learned how to sleep in pieces. 4 hours before opening, 20 minutes in my car, another hour before the next shift. I refused to make that season sound noble. It was not noble. It was exhausting, and sometimes it smelled like toner, fast food wrappers, and rain leaking through the passenger door seal of my old Honda. But exhaustion has a strange way of becoming structure if you survive it long enough. The copy center sat 3 doors down from a small law office owned by Miriam Holt, a woman in her 60s with silver hair, square glasses, and the posture of someone who had spent 40 years watching people lie across desks. She came in twice a week to print closing packets, affidavits, probate forms, and stacks of paper thick enough to make the machine groan. One evening, she caught me reordering a set of pages because the signature blocks did not match the notary certificates. I thought I was in trouble. "Instead," she said, "who taught you to notice that?" I told her nobody. The truth was, I had learned early that the smallest line could cost you the most. Miriam looked at me for a long second and said, "Good. Bad habits are harder to fix than no habits." 2 weeks later, I was working 10 hours a week in her office, scanning files and labeling folders. It was not glamorous. It was paper cuts, stale coffee, and learning that lives could be ruined by one unchecked box. But for the first time, the thing my family had treated like stubbornness, my need to read everything twice, became useful somewhere that did not punish me for it. Miriam taught me what a deed was, what a lien meant, why dates mattered, and why a witness who remembered nothing was almost worse than no witness at all. By 21, I had finished my paralegal certificate one class at a time. By 22, I had my notary commission. I still remember the day the certificate came in the mail. I stood in my apartment kitchen, holding the envelope with both hands, waiting for the old instinct to ruin it, the one that said good news was only safe if I had someone to share it with. Nobody in my family knew. For 5 years, silence was the only thing they sent consistently. Miriam was the one who framed the certificate. She hung it in the office hallway beside my desk and tapped the glass with one red fingernail. "A signature is never just ink, Abby," she said. "It is consent with a timestamp. Don't ever let anyone rush yours." I smiled when she said it. I even wrote it down later. But I did not understand then why those words settled so deep in me. I thought she was teaching me about documents. She was. She was also giving me the sentence that would keep me from handing my life back to the people who had already spent it once. For a while, I believed silence had an expiration date. I thought 5 years would be long enough for a mother to miss the daughter she had sent out the door, or for a father to decide $50 was too small to be his final sentence. But silence does not rot on its own. Some families can keep it fresh for years, wrapped tight in pride and stored beside the good china. Mine did, until a Tuesday evening in July, when my phone lit up with a name I had never deleted because deletion felt too much like pretending. The screen said home, which was strange, because I had not had one of those in their sense of the word for a long time. I was standing in my apartment kitchen, with a bowl of reheated soup cooling beside the sink and a stack of closing documents in my work bag. I let it ring once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th ring, some old reflex reached through me before pride could stop it. and I answered. My mother was crying before I said hello. Abby, thank God, she said. Her voice sounded older, but the rhythm was the same. Urgency first, affection implied, never delivered. Preston needs you. I closed my eyes for 1 second and listened to the years disappear. Not because she had bridged them, but because she stepped over them. She did not walk back through 5 years. She simply placed my brother's name in my hands like another bill, and expected me to recognize the amount. I did not ask if he was okay. That would have been the old Abby, the one trained to run toward the alarm before checking who pulled it. Instead, I asked, "Needs me for what?" The crying softened immediately, shifting into the warm, organized tone my mother used when she already had the answer she wanted. She said there were papers involving Grandma Eleanor's old house in Winterset. Nothing dramatic, just a few formalities. The word landed between us so hard I almost laughed. Formalities. That was what people called a trap, when they wanted you to bring your own pen. I asked her to email me the documents. She hesitated. Not long enough for a stranger to notice, but long enough for a daughter who had survived her kitchen table. Then she said, it would be easier if I came home Sunday, and we discussed it as a family. There it was again, that word polished, clean, and set out like company silver. Family. The place where questions went to die. I told her I did not sign anything I had not read. The line went quiet. I could hear something faint in the background. Maybe a television. Maybe my father pretending not to listen from the next room. My mother said, "Abby, please don't make this harder than it has to be." I looked at the framed notary certificate Miriam had given me, hanging crooked near my little dining table. "Then send the papers," I said, and hung up before she could find my guilt by name. An hour later, my phone rang again from a number I did not recognize. This voice was male, polished, and calm enough to be expensive. He introduced himself as Ellis Rourke, and said he was assisting my family with a financial resolution. He did not ask how I was either. Men like that rarely waste manners where pressure will do. "Your signature," he said, "is the last missing piece." I stood still, the soup untouched, and understood what my mother had left out. This was not reconciliation, it was paperwork with teeth. Before we begin, please subscribe to support the channel. And here is a fun little challenge. Check your phone battery right now. If it is above 18%, comment 1. If it is below 18%, comment 2. Let's see which answer wins today. If you enjoy this story and would like to support our team, you can buy us a cup of coffee through the link in the description. Every contribution helps us continue creating more meaningful, emotional, and captivating stories for you. Thank you so much for your kindness and support. Now, let's begin the story. The next morning, I took a personal hour and drove to Miriam Holt's office before the courthouse opened. She was already there, of course, because Miriam believed sleep was useful, but not always persuasive. I set my phone on her desk and played Ellis Rourke's voicemail twice. She did not interrupt. She only reached for a yellow legal pad and wrote down 3 words. Signature, debt, Winterset. Then she looked over her glasses at me and said, "Nobody uses the phrase financial resolution unless they are trying to make panic sound professional." We pulled Madison County property records first. Grandma Eleanor's house sat on a quiet street in Winterset, the kind of place with a narrow porch, a crabapple tree near the driveway, and wallpaper nobody under 60 would have chosen on purpose. I had not been there since her funeral. My mother said the estate was complicated, then stopped mentioning it. I believed her because grief makes you lazy with questions. That morning, Miriam typed my grandmother's name into the county database, and there it was, recorded cleanly. Transfer. On death deed. Beneficiary. Abigail May Whitaker. For a few seconds, I did not understand what I was seeing. Not because the words were hard, because my family had trained me to assume anything good with my name on it was probably a clerical mistake. Miriam turned the monitor slightly toward me and tapped the screen with the capped end of a pen. "This house passed to you when Eleanor died," she said. "Or it was supposed to." The assessed value was $312,000. Not a mansion, not a fortune. But more than enough for people with debt to start calling love a legal strategy. Then Miriam found the lien paperwork. Preston's name was on it. So was Ellis Rourke's company. The amount listed made my stomach tighten before my brain finished reading it. $186,000, with fees folded into fees until the numbers looked swollen. The collateral section referred to the Winterset property as if Preston had any right to put it on the table. And on one scanned page, near the bottom, there was a copy of my signature. Abigail M. Whitaker. Tilted too far to the right. Too round on the W. Almost mine. If you had only met me through Christmas cards. I did not cry. I wish I could tell you I did, because crying would have made sense. Instead, I stared at that signature until it stopped looking like handwriting and started looking like trespassing. They had taken my money when I was 18 because my mother's name was on the account. Legal, maybe. Wrong, absolutely. But this was different. This was my name placed on a document by a hand that did not have permission to borrow my life. Miriam asked where I had been on the date beside the signature. That was the first moment I felt something other than cold. I opened my notary journal from the locked drawer beside my desk and found the entry in less than a minute. Cedar Rapids. A retired couple refinancing their home. 2 IDs checked, 2 signatures witnessed, mileage logged, invoice emailed at 4:42 p.m. I had proof. Not dramatic proof. Not movie proof. Better. Boring proof. The kind that survives fluorescent lights and cross-examination. Miriam leaned back in her chair and said, "This is not a misunderstanding, Abby. This is someone hoping you were still the girl at the kitchen table." I looked at the forged signature again, at the house my grandmother had left me, at the debt my brother had dragged across my name like mud on clean floorboards. 5 years earlier, they had put a pen in front of me and asked me to lie. This time, they had tried writing the lie themselves, and now they needed me to make it true. Miriam told me not to go home alone, which was exactly why I went alone, not because I was brave. Bravery is a word people use later when they already know you lived. I went because I needed to see the room where my name had become useful again. If I let my mother explain it first, she would wrap the whole thing in prayer requests and Preston's stress and Grace's needs until the shape of the lie softened around the edges. I knew that family too well. Whoever set the table usually got to decide what was served. Sunday afternoon, I drove back to Ankeny with my notary journal locked in my trunk and my phone recording before I reached the driveway. The house looked smaller than it had in my memory, which annoyed me. Pain should at least have the decency to stay the size it was when it broke you. The lawn was trimmed, the mailbox was freshly painted. The same wooden blessing hung inside the entryway, dusted and straight. Preston's framed photos still climbed the wall by the stairs. Baseball, graduation, Grace, as a newborn in his arms. There were no pictures of me after 17. My mother opened the door like she had been expecting a prodigal daughter instead of a witness. She touched my shoulder, then seemed to remember she had lost the right to hug me and let her hand fall. "You look thin," she said, because mothers like mine can turn concern into a small accusation without changing volume. My father stood behind her with a coffee mug in both hands. It was July, and warm enough that no one needed coffee. He gave me one quick look, then aimed his eyes at the living room carpet. Preston came out next, older in the face but not in the posture. He smiled too wide and said, "There she is," like I had been late to a barbecue instead of absent from their lives for 5 years. He hugged me before I could decide whether to allow it. His shirt smelled like drugstore cologne and panic sweat. "I knew you'd come through," he said against my hair. "Not thank you. Not I'm sorry." A job posting filled. I stepped back and saw my mother watching my reaction, the way she used to watch me read report cards, checking whether I would make her proud by not making trouble. That was when I saw Grace. She sat at the far end of the couch, with her ankles crossed and her hands folded over a navy blue canvas bag. 7 years old, quiet enough that the adults had managed to forget she was information. She had Preston's dark eyes, and none of his noise. The bag rested against her knees like something assigned to her. 2 library books stuck out of the top. A gray hoodie was rolled tight beside them. When I looked at it too long, Grace looked down and pressed both palms over the opening. I sat on the chair across from her, not too close. Children who monitor rooms do not like surprises. "That's a nice bag," I said. Grace glanced toward my mother before answering. "It's for just in case." My mother laughed softly from the kitchen doorway, a sound meant to tell me not to take it seriously. She carries books everywhere now, very dramatic. But Grace did not laugh. She kept one hand on the strap and said, almost too quietly, "Grandma said to keep it ready if the papers don't work." The room changed temperature. Not enough for anyone else to admit it, but enough for me. I looked at my mother. She was suddenly busy arranging napkins that did not need arranging. Preston said, "She doesn't understand grown-up stuff." And that was true in the cruelest way. Grace did not understand liens or transfer deeds or forged signatures. She did not understand why Ellis Rourke had my family scared enough to call me. But children understand when adults talk about them like weather damage. They understand when a bag by their feet matters. I asked Grace what was inside. She hesitated, then opened it with the solemn care of someone showing an inspector, a room she had cleaned herself. 2 books, the hoodie, a sleeve of crackers, a small hairbrush, and a folded sheet of notebook paper with my phone number written in uneven pencil. My throat tightened around something I refused to perform in that room. "Where did you get my number?" I asked. Grace looked at the paper. "From Grandma's phone," she said. "She said you were the aunt who signs things." For a second, all I could hear was the refrigerator humming behind me, the same low sound from the morning I lost my home. I had arrived to inspect a lie about property. Instead, I found a child packing herself around it. 5 years earlier, I had left with a brown backpack because my parents decided I would survive the cost of Preston's. I did not confront my mother in that living room. Not with Grace sitting there holding a bag packed by adult fear. I had learned enough from Miriam to know the difference between a moment that feels satisfying and a moment that becomes useful. Satisfaction would have been asking Marlene how long she had been teaching a 7-year-old to prepare for consequences she did not create. Useful meant standing up, telling Grace I liked library books too, and leaving before my face gave anyone a map of what I knew. Ellis Rourke called before I reached the interstate. He did not ask how the family visit went. Of course he didn't. Men like Ellis never ask questions they cannot invoice. He suggested we meet Monday morning at a diner near the courthouse, somewhere public, he said, as if public meant honest. I agreed because I wanted to see whether he looked like the kind of man who could sleep after turning a child into leverage. The answer, when he walked in at 8:10 wearing a gray suit and a watch brighter than the silverware, was yes. He slid into the booth across from me and placed a folder between us without ordering coffee. That told me everything. People who skip coffee in diners are either in a hurry or used to being obeyed. Ellis was both. His voice was polished, almost pleasant, and he called me Miss Whitaker, as if respect were something he could staple to a threat. He said Preston had made unfortunate commitments. He said my parents were trying to preserve stability. He said a signature from me would let everyone avoid escalation. Escalation for whom? I asked. Ellis smiled with no teeth. For everyone connected to the property. There it was. The Winterset house, dressed up as a shared problem. He talked about default notices, legal exposure, collection timelines, and reputational harm. He mentioned my father's farm equipment shop, my mother's position at church, Preston's parenting situation. Then, lightly, almost kindly, he mentioned Grace. Children feel instability most, he said, folding his hands on top of the folder. I'm sure you don't want your niece pulled through adult stubbornness. I looked at his hands. Clean nails, no wedding ring. A faint scar across one knuckle. Details help when anger wants to blur a room. Adult stubbornness, I repeated. Is that what you call refusing to validate a document I didn't sign? The smile thinned, but it stayed. That was Ellis's talent. He could make pressure sound like procedure. He said nobody was accusing me of anything, that the paperwork simply needed to be corrected, clarified, finalized, 3 soft words for the same hard thing. Then he leaned back and said the sentence I had been waiting for. "I don't need your feelings, Miss Whitaker. I need your signature." I almost thanked him. Not aloud, but inside, some quiet part of me did. Because people like Ellis are careful until they believe you are already cornered. Then they show you the blade and call it a pen. My phone was in my coat pocket, recording every word, not because I wanted drama, but because Miriam had taught me the first rule of surviving polished men with folders. Let them explain themselves in their own voice. By Tuesday morning, my mother's version of the story had already reached people who had not called me in 5 years. That was how I knew she was scared. Marlene Whitaker did not raise her voice when she felt cornered. She raised a prayer request. By noon, my phone had 2 texts from women at church, whose numbers I did not remember saving. One said my mother was heartbroken. The other said bitterness could make good people cruel. Neither asked what had happened. In my mother's world, asking questions was what strangers did. Family accepted the version served warm. Sunday service was the first time I saw the campaign with my own eyes. I went because hiding would have turned me into the villain she had already described. The sanctuary smelled like old hymnals, lemon polish, and coffee waiting in the fellowship hall. My mother sat 3 rows from the front in a pale blue dress, dabbing her eyes before anyone had said anything sad. Preston sat beside her with Grace between his knees, one hand resting on her shoulder like a claim. My father held a bulletin folded into a thin white rectangle. After the closing prayer, people moved toward the potluck tables, and the room filled with casseroles, plastic forks, and careful sympathy. Mrs. Donnelly, who had taught me vacation Bible school when I was 9, touched my arm and said, "Your mother has suffered enough, sweetheart." A man from the finance committee told me families survived hard seasons by keeping private things private. Reverend Callum Briggs asked if we could speak in his office, gently, as if gentleness changed the weight of being summoned. I went because I still respected gray hair and church offices, even when both were being used badly. Reverend Briggs folded his hands on the desk and said my mother feared I was letting old wounds guide new decisions. He talked about forgiveness, about softening, about the danger of letting legal language replace grace. I listened until he finished. Then I asked him whether grace required a person to sign papers she had not read. His mouth opened, then closed. That was the first honest thing that happened in that room. In the hallway afterward, Grace found me beside the bulletin board. She had the Navy library bag hanging from one shoulder, the strap twisted in both hands. "Grandma said if you don't sign, Daddy might lose everything," she whispered. Then she looked up at me with those 2 careful eyes and asked, "Is everything where kids go?" I had no answer ready for a question that small and that large. Children do not understand collateral or liens. They understand being packed before anyone tells them where. I crouched so she did not have to look up to be heard. "You are not paperwork," I said, "and you are not a consequence." She stared at me like I had spoken a language she wanted to learn but did not trust yet. Across the hall, my mother watched us over a paper plate of potato salad, her face arranged into concern for anyone passing by. I stood slowly, took out my phone, and called Simone Avery. When she answered, I said, "I need to report something, not an emergency. A pattern." Simone Avery did not ask me to prove I was upset. That was the first reason I trusted her. She asked for dates, names, and whether Grace had heard adults discuss where she might go if I refused to sign. By Thursday morning, Miriam and I were sitting in a courthouse annex conference room with Simone beside the wall, a yellow folder in her lap, and the kind of silence that makes every chair sound guilty when it moves. Across the table sat my mother, my father, Preston, Ellis Rourke, and a lawyer who looked too young to know how old family damage can be. The papers were already waiting when I walked in. Of course they were. My family loved setting a table for me. This time, It was not a kitchen table, but the shape was familiar. A printed agreement, a clean signature line, and a black pen placed diagonally across the bottom, as if the pen itself had authority. My mother gave me a small, hopeful smile. "Just sign, honey," she said. "You'll be fine." The room went still inside me. Some sentences do not echo. They reload. I looked at the pen, then at her. "That sentence cost me $11,840 in 5 years of my life," I said. "I'm not letting it cost Grace her home, too." Ellis shifted first. Men like him dislike when emotion enters a room with documentation behind it. Miriam opened her folder and began laying pages on the table. The ATM receipt, the old family assistance agreement, the Madison County deed, my notary journal from Cedar Rapids, the invoice timestamp, the recording transcript from the diner. Ellis's lawyer reached for the transcript like it might bite him. Miriam did not raise her voice. She never did when paper could do the work. "Miss Whitaker was not present when this signature was allegedly made," she said. "And Mr. Rourke's own statement confirms her current signature is necessary to cure the defect." Cure. That was the word. As if my name were a bandage they could press over a wound they made themselves. Preston's face had gone red in patches. My father stared at his folded hands. My mother whispered that this was not the place. That was when Preston stood halfway out of his chair and said, "She was always supposed to fix this. That's what she does." Nobody answered him. Nobody had to. The sentence landed in the room with its shoes on, tracking the whole family system across the floor. Simone looked up from her folder. "Mrs. Whitaker," she said. "Did Grace hear adults discussing what might happen to her if Miss Whitaker refused to sign?" My mother opened her mouth, then closed it. For once, no polished version arrived fast enough to save her. I picked up the pen, felt its weight, and set it back down exactly where it had been. "No," I said. "I won't sign." Ellis stood and buttoned his jacket. "This is not over." Miriam looked at him over her glasses. "No," she said. "But now it has witnesses." The first thing that happened afterward was nothing dramatic. No one was arrested in the hallway. No one fainted. No one begged. Ellis Rourke left with his lawyer, both of them walking too fast for men who had arrived so calm. Miriam filed the report before lunch. By the end of the week, the Winterset house was protected under a formal dispute notice, and the forged signature had become something my family could no longer whisper around. It had a file number now. File numbers are not justice, but they are harder to gaslight than daughters. Preston was put on a repayment plan he complained about, as if consequences were a weather event aimed at him personally. My mother stopped teaching Sunday school for a while, officially to focus on family healing. Unofficially, people had started asking questions in rooms where she could not control the answers. Reverend Briggs called me 2 weeks later and said, "I should have asked more before I advised you." It was not a full apology, but it was the first church sentence I had heard in years that did not arrive carrying a bill. My father came to my apartment once in August. He stood outside my door, holding a white envelope with my name, written on it in careful block letters. Inside were 2 20s and a 10. $50. Again. I looked at the bills, then at him. He said, "I didn't know how to say it back then." I believed him. That did not make it enough. I handed the envelope back and said, "Then learn how to say it now." He nodded like a man accepting homework he should have done 20 years earlier. Simone recommended that Grace stay with me temporarily while the county reviewed the pressure being put on her at home. Temporary is a small word until a child carries it into your hallway with a navy blue library bag. The first night, Grace asked where she should put her things. I showed her the spare room, the dresser, the closet, the little shelf by the bed. She nodded at each one like she was memorizing exits. I did not tell her she was safe. Adults had probably told her that before. I showed her where the crackers went. A week later, I found her in the living room with the bag open on the floor. She moved the hoodie to the closet, the books to the shelf, the hairbrush to the bathroom drawer. The folded paper with my phone number went on the refrigerator under a magnet shaped like Iowa, not because she needed it, but because she liked seeing her own handwriting. Last, she set the empty bag on the doorknob and asked if she could use it for library day. I said, "That's what bags are supposed to be for." Years later, people still ask whether I forgave my family. They usually mean whether I went back to the old table and let everyone call the wound a misunderstanding. I did not. The Winterset house is still mine. Grace is 13 now and uses that navy bag for library books, swim towels, and occasionally snacks she claims are emergency supplies. She argues about screen time like a normal kid with a secure roof, which is its own kind of miracle. I was 18 when my parents sent me out with an old backpack because they believed I would be fine. They were right, just not in the way they meant. Being fine did not mean signing whatever they put in front of me. It did not mean making myself useful enough to be loved. Sometimes being fine means holding the pen, reading every line, and knowing the strongest word in the room is no. If this story leaves anything behind, I hope it is this. Love should never require you to disappear in order for someone else to feel safe. For a long time, Abby believed being fine meant being quiet. It meant absorbing the cost, carrying the bag, signing the paper, answering the phone, and making sure no one else had to face the mess they created. In some families, responsibility gets confused with love. The person who survives the most is asked to carry even more, because everyone has mistaken their endurance for permission. But survival is not consent. Just because someone can handle pain does not mean they should be handed more of it. Just because a daughter is capable does not mean she is available to be used. Just because someone has always landed on her feet does not mean the people who pushed her get credit for her balance. Family can be one of the deepest forms of love, but family can also become the word people use when they want access without accountability. Real family does not ask you to erase the truth to keep the peace. Real family does not make a child pack a bag before she knows where she is going. Real family does not put a pen in your hand and call your surrender forgiveness. Abby's strength was not that she walked out at 18 with an old backpack. Her strength was not that she rebuilt her life from almost nothing. Her real strength came later, when she finally understood that being good did not mean being easy to use. It came when she looked at the paper, the pressure, the guilt, and the people who raised her, and still said no. That is what healing often looks like in real life. Not revenge, not shouting, not proving everyone wrong in one perfect scene. Sometimes, healing is a quiet room, a steady hand, a child unpacking a bag, and a person finally realizing they do not have to keep paying invoices disguised as love. So, if someone in your life keeps calling you strong right before they ask you to bleed for them, take this as your reminder. You are allowed to have boundaries and still have a heart. You are allowed to say no and still be a good person. If this story touched something real in you, subscribe to the channel, share your thoughts in the comments, and tell us, what was the moment you finally stopped signing your life away for someone else?